Dignity of Women, where we dig deep into the vocation and dignity of women in the church in modern times and as an answer to the call for a new evangelization. I'm your host, Kimberly Cook. Joining me today is Erika Bachiochi. Erika is an EPPC fellow. She is a legal scholar who works at the intersection of constitutional law, political theory, women's history, and Catholic social teaching. She is the editor-in-chief of Fairer Disputations, the online journal of sex realist feminism. Erika is author of The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision. And I'm so happy to invite you today to join us on the podcast. Thanks for being here, Erika.
Thanks for having me, Kimberly.
I want to dive right in to your book, which I really enjoyed, The Rights of Women. One of the things that you based your book on, you said Wollstonecraft's guiding principles remain the central theme of your book, namely the hope for married women that intellectual pursuits and professional occupations would not be incompatible with domestic duties. This requires both women and men to prioritize the domestic sphere and the great good of human formation taking place there. Wollstonecraft hoped women would not value accomplishments more than virtues. So, Erika, how are we doing in the 21st century?
Well, I think that we're valuing accomplishments much more than virtues. That's
Yeah.
certainly not so good, which is why the need for the book, right? So the subtitle is Reclaiming a Lost Vision. So trying to sort of bring back and articulate a vision that I think is based on real noble principles and high ideals that women don't have sort of access to. Trying to frame that and bring it out to potentially and hopefully, I think it's been happening. The book is now, what, 4 years old or so? Trying to sort of, launch a renewed women's movement based on moral principles rather than, what I think of as kind of a market logic, real interest in market equality, being equally producers and consumers with men, which I think is pretty hollow.
Yes, and I think you did a good way of rounding that out throughout the book, speaking about those accomplishments and what we valued throughout the centuries, from being more moral based and home formative to being marketplace and production based, and how men were easily kind of led down that road, and then women followed right after with the same mentality. And now we almost find ourselves stuck all together as a society outside of the home with these, as you said, hollow values on production, and realizing that that doesn't really resonate with who we are, with the human soul, with our desire for excellence and virtue. How do we return again to that idea, that Wollstonecraftian idea of valuing accomplishments more than virtues post-industrial revolution?
Yeah, so I never think that the idea of return is a good one just because we are, where we are historically. And so I, think it's important to live where we are today and be grateful for our time and then think about how to build from here with what we have, especially sort of in our economic and political moment, which is of course a difficult one. So I guess what, I'm trying to do in the book is just show that we really have abandoned focus that most people had really throughout human civilization on the kind of formation that takes place between parents and children. And obviously at some point there's a time, it's actually around 15th 16th century, when childhood becomes something. So clearly you don't have the idea of a time set aside for childhood where moral formation is taking place the way we do. But certainly with the rise of Christianity, there's such an interest in the eternal soul, the need for sanctity, and so I think like trying to reclaim a vision that helps us to see how important the role that mothers and fathers have in the lives of children, but that they also then have in the lives of just citizens writ large because of the formative work that they do, that just the time that's spent with children, having them work alongside you, which obviously was much easier in an agrarian society, but now needs a lot more kind of intention about it. But that I think all of the virtues that are sort of inculcated in that sphere of the home with those who love them most is really kind of the bedrock of how you have any other virtues. I start the book really with kind of decrying the the state of our leadership, political leadership, in really all different institutions in society. There's a real lack of exemplars, moral exemplars, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we don't take seriously the important work that mothers especially, but fathers as well do in like inculcating manners and those basic human virtues. I think about, how hard it is to do that when your children are young and how we don't really see how important it is. And we sort of pass by those, they're one, they're two, they're three, but yet those formative years are really crafting their characters for the future. And so to just take more seriously that time, I think, and see that if we're troubled about the time that we live in, that maybe giving more regard for that work would actually help us a great deal because it is hard work, but it's also really ennobling to the people who do it and it's for the care and concern of the child. I think there's an idea that we're caring for children when we're driving them around to sports and all that, and of course we are, but I think the more important part than the sport is the kind of character formation that happens in the sport or that happens in the car with your parents while you're driving, and I'm sure you do a lot of that too. So those conversations of really helping them become the people that God wants them to be, that they have the capacity to become.
Erica, I really appreciate that coming from you because you are a mother of 7, correct?
That's right.
And you are also doing all of these great works to help other women in society and men, as you said as well. You're not forgetting about the men either, but to advance the idea that we need to incorporate these very important roles of the home, of the family, of the legacy that they can add to their family and to their children. Obviously, we live in a different time than Wollstonecraft did, where women do have access to education, voting rights. But you refer more than once to the quote, an active mind embraces the whole circle of its duties and finds time enough for all. That was a quote that stuck out to me. And when it came up several times, I found that I was highlighting it, more than once. So I want to look at that quote in light of modernity, in which many mothers do find themselves struggling to balance their obligations of home and children, family life, with the desires of personal pursuits such as intellectual, professional, or simply the necessity of working outside the home in their situation. What would Wollstonecraft say to modern American women, especially in light of this quote? And what could you maybe add to that as a mother of 7 who also does a lot of work outside the home as well?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I would say is how important two parts. I mean, in that very quote there, you mentioned the active mind, which I think is really critical, and then the duties. So I want to talk about both. The first is that a big concern of Wollstonecraft, and pretty much anyone who reads her, even though she can be misunderstood if we don't read her carefully, anyone who reads her can see how important education is. And so when I first read her, I was a women's studies student in the mid 1990s before my conversion, and I'm grateful for that. I learned. But when I first read her, I just read excerpts and it was all about women's education. And why was that so important? Because one of the things you have to do when you read Wollstonecraft is recognize that she's not just sort of writing these kind of autonomous kind of philosophical treaties. She's interacting with interlocutors. So in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, her most important work, she's interacting especially with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but other kind of educational theorists in her time and in the late 18th century. And the idea of women's education there was basically, Rousseau would say that women's education was ordered to men, that it was to make them pleasing to men and capable of really caring for men. And so it wasn't to educate the woman for her own, because she's, has great dignity or has a capacity to reason or anything like that. Although, of course, he did think women could reason, but that it was an education directed entirely toward men. And so she's concerned because of the need for women to become independent of mind, which for her means independence of mind is not in order to go off and kind of, follow one's passions or something. It's in order to carry out one's duties. And so a real answer to your question is that like an active mind then is one who is able to independently or voluntarily carry out the duties she has. And so for her, the duties are kind of ordered. And so there's duties to God, kind of trust and providence, and ensure that one is responsible to God for her own capacities, for her reason. Then also duties to her parents, duties to her spouse, should she have a spouse, duties to her children, first and foremost. And then in all of that, it's also duties as a citizen, hopefully, and she understood women as citizens of her time, but not as equal citizens because they couldn't participate, of course, in the political sphere. But so there's just the ordering of duties is really important. And so that's why she's saying, well, they don't need to conflict necessarily, and they ought
Right.
not if a woman has a well-ordered life. And so she really believed that if a woman was kind of intentional about what she prioritized and
Hmm.
was living an actively virtuous life, then she would be able to prioritize things rightly. And of course, her family obligations come first, and then you could fit in, as she would say, those other kinds of obligations too. But even above all that, though, it's like even before, in some sense, family obligations, there's the obligation to cultivate oneself. Because if one isn't cultivating virtue, then one is of no good to anyone else. And she was very concerned that because of this high, I mean, she really regarded motherhood as a very high, and fatherhood too, as very high kind of vocations because of the way in which private virtue, those inculcations in the home, like I was talking about before, the inculcated virtue in the home is what gives way to public virtue. And so she knew those were very high, important tasks. And so that's why women had to be educated, but that's why women also had to cultivate virtue in themselves so that they could do that in their own children. And so all of those are important. But I think the aspect of duty is really, and responsibility is really central. And it's something that we've especially lost where, my book is called The Rights of Woman. Her book is called The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And yet duty and virtue are much more central concepts than even rights because they're all deeply interconnected. I mean, a lot of the work I do as a legal theorist is looking at the way in which our rights theory has completely sort of lost the concept of duties and virtues, whereas it was really central to it in at least Wollstonecraft's view. And so she was really promoting rights as interconnected with duties and virtues.
No, that's great. And I know she has several other quotes as well that I didn't write down, but I did take note of as I was reading it that have the same spirit to them you were talking about, and you explained a little bit more of what she meant by the active mind, but also the importance of home and especially her duty as mother, and speaking to many other women who had primary mother duties and home duties and how they interconnect. Especially again for you, you were saying the active. So how does that look for you? How have you been able to, throughout 7 kids, the
All
birth
right.
of 7, the raising of 7 kids? And I know I'm asking this not only for myself, but I'm
Yeah.
sure a lot of people are wondering, how do you do it? How do you, and I'm sure you get asked a lot, how do you do it, right? How do you do it all?
Yeah. But just with regard to Wollstonecraft, that she wasn't a mother when she was writing Vindication of the Rights of Women. So
Right.
these
Yes,
were,
that was
yeah,
before.
these were
Okay.
theoretical questions for her at that point, although obviously she was the oldest of her own family. And so she did act as a mother to her own siblings and then as a governess and then as a school mistress, school founder and all that. So she did have the experience of being around mothers and she wrote a book called The Education of Our Daughter. So these things were important, but I just wanted to just sort of get to that, just a little fact. So in my own life, after college, gained a master's in theology and then a law degree. But right away, actually during law school, I got married my second year and then had my first child my third year and had come from a pretty broken home. And so knew pretty clearly that I needed to focus on being a mom. I had a pretty steep learning curve, I would say. So it's funny just seeing my own children. They have just much more capacity than I would say when I was first married because of being raised in our family, right? And so I just had a lot of things I had to kind of work out at the beginning.
Right.
Whereas my children are ages 6, and then I have a big 7-year gap, and then I have 6 children in 10 years. The oldest is 23. So just in seeing their kind of, my oldest 3 girls kind of contemplating these questions, they have all this experience seeing a healthy marriage and then also helping take care of little babies, that's not like an overwhelming thing for them. It's like a very ordinary thing for them. So they just, I think, have much more capacity than I do. And I think many women are like that. They can, kind of walk and chew gum at the same time. And it's not, babies are not something new to them. Whereas for me, it was very hard and new. I had babysat as a child. So I didn't have a lot of experience. And there was just like a lot of brokenness and kind of wounds that I still had. So for me, I very much focused. My husband was able to provide for us. And so in the early days, I did do a little bit of work here and there that was helping us financially, but just like literally 5 hours a week at the most when my first baby was napping. And then I actually was invited to edit a book. So my first book, The Cost of Choice, was from a series of symposia done around the 30th anniversary of Roe v. Wade, if I'm remembering correctly. And so I edited those again when my baby was sleeping. And then when after my second baby came, I was actually out giving talks around every once in a while, like student pro-life groups would have me give a talk on that book. So I did a little bit of work at that point, but I was mainly like home doing kind of the work of the home and building up the community around me, being part of the community around me with other moms. And it was a very good time for me. And my husband was, I mean, part of the story, those who know my husband, when they read The Rights of Women, they're like, this story, Mary Ann Glendon said it was a love letter to my husband, Dan. And in that way, I mean, he was from a very, really beautiful family. He's the oldest of four and very like family oriented family. And he just really like from the time his youngest brother was born when Dan was 12, he was a summer baby, he like held him the whole summer. By the time Dan and I got married, like he was much more baby oriented and family oriented and ready for a family. And so even though I was mainly home, he was so oriented around our family. And so his work, it was fine and it was important to him in a lot of ways. But like the work we did at home together was just so much more important. And it's always been like that ever since. And so I think having that spouse who's so wholeheartedly committed and sees the work I was doing at home is so important. I mean, I remember him saying, like, why would I ever want somebody else to take care of our children? Like, I married you because I want you to be the first one to take care of our children because I think you're amazing. So, like, those basic kind of things early on. And we had a lot of kids really fast. And that was really hard because I didn't really, that was tough, but it really brought me to my knees a lot. I mean, I grew a lot in my faith at that point. I had come back to the church in college, but it was a really good, important kind of struggle for me to really grow closer to God in those times. I used to call it the motherhood monastery because I really learned a lot about the grace that comes from offering our struggles, that I would like offer things, I'd be up in the middle of the night and I'd think about like, gosh, I can't do pro-life work now, but I can think about the mom home all by herself and has like no amazing husband and she's nursing in the middle of the night and she's just alone and I can offer this difficulty that I'm having getting my baby back to sleep for that woman. And it was just like a very profound thing that I learned to do that has been with me really since. That, of course, is a great like traditional teaching of the Catholic Church. So I would say like that exercise of offering struggles at home for others then became offering anything that was going on at home for kind of inspirations I would have about writing things. And I would often get the inspirations while I was praying the rosary. This was like a very common occurrence. So occasionally I would just write. So then I had ideas for a second book, which became Women's Sex in the Church, a case for Catholic teaching, which basically was my own desire that I had as someone, as I mentioned, who had been a women's studies student, very serious socialist, feminist, anti-Catholic, etc. in college, had that conversion. And I wanted to craft a book that would basically reveal how pro-woman the church's teachings were, which is what I experienced them to be, really saw the church and her teachings as being more, I guess, feminist in the JP2 understanding of feminist than anything I had read in my classes that were promoting feminism. And so I was really eager to really rely on philosophical arguments, sociological data, medical data, et cetera, to promote Catholic teaching for women. And then I went on to just kind of speak a little on that and write on that. So it was still very much within the confines of being an at-home mom. So how do I do it now, which is very different? So probably five children, 6 children or so. I decided to start a classical school. So that actually, which is now so it started with 25 kids and now it has like 350 kids. It's an amazing school here in the Boston area. So that was the first time when I saw like, oh, I can really juggle more than I thought I could. And so it was obviously voluntary.
With Little Women, because you're in that area too. It's like, I think I'll start a school.
Yeah, right. I know. Yeah, I know. And then to learn, Wollstonecraft had started school too. Yeah. So anyway, it was something that I started to recognize like, oh, I have a lot more capacity now to do this. And I still had little children then. I mean, I had some older children. I had a girl who was working at a school near us who lived with us. And so she helped out a little bit. And I just started to get like more of an ebb and flow in life. I started to get a lot more confidence with having children, with being a mother I think my husband and I just started to get more of a rhythm together. So I started to be able to take on more. And when we were starting the school, I just did a whole lot, and I saw my kids could just play around, and even before that, I would read a lot. I read a ton when I was home. And so I just saw that I had more capacity, I guess is the best way of putting it. And so as my children grew and, we started to educate them and need to pay for schools, then I started to see that potentially I could start earning more money than I had just doing little talks here and there. And so that's what started to happen. And I guess it was me looking for things, but it was also from the outside looking at me maybe as a career. I see very much as a vocation. I mean, I've always been someone who is, and this is just a blessing of having, for the most part, until like this crunch over the last probably 10 years, financial crunch. But before that, it was very much like I was able to rely on my husband's income. We worked together, doing all of our work together in some sense. So had the freedom really and the leisure, I think, to be kind of an intellectual or, without having to go and find ways to earn money. And that leisure gave me the capacity to just sort of say what I thought I needed to say. And so I actually started doing law review articles. And the reason I did that is because from those two books, I started getting asked by professors to come speak. And so I was asked by a group of pro-life professors to give a talk on what was going on among feminists in the legal academy. So I did this giant talk and it became a giant law review article in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. And that sort of started shifting me back into working in law. And I'd been reading enough in it. So it was just taking the step into spending the time. And I mean, you asked in terms of people listening in and yourself and all that. I think a lot of it is just discipline. So part of it is the prayer, the aspect of prayer, of really ensuring that our lives are ordered as God would have them be. And so, of course, first, I go to daily mass, I pray the rosary every day. So, like, all those kinds of things are important for ordering the soul. But then, of course, that our marriage is doing well, right? And then that our children are doing well. And then work kind of comes last in some sense, but it doesn't mean it's like a teeny bit of time. It can be more time, depending again on capacity and need, especially financial need. And so, making sure that when I work, I'm not wasting my time checking email, but I have time in the morning when I'm writing that's like just for writing. And then I have time for reading that's just for reading. And then I have time for editing. Like I used to always edit all my stuff. Kids are around and they'd see me like there editing. I still do that. Or I'd be like, print out law review articles and be pushing them in the swings and be reading law review articles. So it was just like I read around them, but they also played together. I had so many children so fast that they just were always playing together. So that's what I would say is be the ebb and the flow. I mean, the last thing I'll say is that a lot of the time I spend doing my intellectual work, I think other women would spend with more like maybe hospitality or ensuring that their homes are really beautifully decorated or other kinds of things like that. And I'm not a particularly artistic person. I'm not a particularly creative person. I just feel very called to the intellectual life. So I guess that's the trade-off is that I just don't do a lot of those things. Like I have a very functional home. I don't like really shopping at all. In fact, all of my clothes are hand-me-downs from my cousin and my sister and my stepmom. So like there's certain things that some other women are like kind of, well, how do you do all this? It's like, I don't do a lot of those things, So
No, I really appreciate all of that. And a few of the things that I was trying to note as you were speaking, because I was like, oh, that's good. I want to bring that up. So, but then it like went on to another thing. I'm like, oh, this is so good. But a few of the things that I kind of noted myself as I was listening is first of all, the solidarity. You were saying getting up in the middle of the night, maybe with a crying baby and thinking of the women that don't have the supportive husband or maybe the home and the support that you have to be able to offer that solidarity and in that way to offer a communal, not necessarily suffering, but
yeah.
there's this sisterhood in that moment, and you're able to think of others, and also, especially in the Catholic view, is to offer that up as a real prayer. So that was one thing that struck me. And also, I mean, we have similar stories in the sense that we didn't have any practice with children before. My husband and I, when we had our first child, it was the first diaper that either of us had ever changed. And we had to practice on, a teddy bear beforehand and stuff because we were like, we didn't know which way was front and back or whatever. We didn't come from big families. We didn't have younger siblings that we took care of. We didn't have cousins or anything like that. So we had no experience with babies whatsoever. And that was really daunting. And then for me, getting into the feminist movement before marriage and having this anti-motherhood, anti-marriage mentality before my conversion, there was a lot of healing that needed to take place for the brokenness, but not only for the brokenness, also the lack of desire for those things for so long that when my heart did start changing, I still had, like you said, a big learning curve. I didn't have the capacity, I didn't have the understanding or the knowledge of a lot of those things that came natural, say for your husband, and just the experience of a family and a household, which that was normal. And with your kids growing up, where that's almost secondhand for them and they have a greater capacity. The word capacity, you said it several times, and I do think that it's true. I think that we do have different capacities, and hopefully that capacity does grow as we grow. I related a lot to your story in that sense of
Yeah.
entering marriage, maybe not on the same level playing field as some of the other women surrounding me. So that was something. And then also the fact that you so beautifully articulated how you incorporated pushing children on the swings as you were reading law articles or taking on work as it came and not so much looking for it. It was really an organic trajectory, which God was very much involved. Your main focus was really on your children, your husband, God, in right order. And then you did have this desire and this love that, of course, God knows is written upon your heart for the academic, and God has continued to draw those out and to use you in different areas. And so I think that is a beautiful way to articulate it and to look at it as well for people from the outside, because we are in a time right now where we do look from the outside. You know, we're in a Pinterest world, we're in an Instagram world, and we do look at people's accomplishments. Again, going back to that first question, and we do value those accomplishments. How is, this woman, that woman, the other woman doing all these things? How are they
Yeah.
able to juggle all these things? And then again, it comes back to what's wrong with me, or why am I not able to have this capacity or to do all of these things? And then, of course, to the focus of I have a determination to finish this project that I set out to do. And so I'm going to have to be really disciplined with my time because I only have an hour here or an hour there. And so that full hour needs to be dedicated to the work. I think, again, that comes down to a learned skill that not all of us possess right off the bat, but it's a virtue that you grow in and a discipline that you force yourself when you have this desire to accomplish something.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I was thinking as you were talking that the capacity I did have, I didn't have capacity for children. I mean, I did physically, but like taking care of children. But I did have a lot of lung capacity as an athlete, and that's where the discipline came from too. As a kid, I was mainly focused on athletics. Like I played sports all the way through college and come from a really athletic family. So both my mom and my dad are really athletic and really disciplined, like super hard workers. And so even if they couldn't like stay married, and, for a long time, I resented them for that. They gave me other traits of theirs that are really, remarkable in so many ways. And so I'm really grateful for the kinds of things that they did pass down, both through being examples, but then, I guess through the bloodstream, who knows? I'm not sure how these things work. But
Right.
yeah. And so I'm grateful for that because it did give me, like having 6 children in 10 years is no joke, right? So I think the athletic aspects of me, like the real physical, grueling aspects of growing up, right? And putting myself, in the pool again and again when I didn't want. It was like those kinds of things came through big time for me. I always think too, like so did waitressing. Not
Oh,
because
wow.
like serving in the home, not that at all, but like I was like at a very fast-paced restaurant where I grew up in Maine, touristy Maine, and so I prided myself on being able to get to so many different tables really fast. And so like having a lot of children, it's an order, like, okay, I'm going to go to this table. They need that. They need that. And so there's like an ordering of the mind, whether it's, through also learning logic and doing well in math and all those kinds of things, but also that restaurant experience ordered my mind. And I have a very orderly mind. And so it helps both with the kind of work I do, which is philosophical and legal, but then also in terms of ordering all of the different kids and their schedules. Like that part is not hard for me. That part's a little overwhelming for other people. And so you just kind of see what are our talents and as you say, how is God going to use me? Like how can I be of help?
And
So
you talk about the gifts too. Like you might not have the most artistic or
exactly.
creative
Exactly.
house. Like people might not be Pinteresting your style or
They're definitely not Pinteresting. It looks like you could have some Pinterest behind you. I don't even know what Pinterest is. I'm that bad.
something. No, but it's, I mean, like you said, we can't all do it all, right? You can't have the perfect everything. The real core is, what is God calling you to, right? Where are your gifts? Because some people are very creative and they're able to cultivate this beauty. Think about if Michelangelo was like, painting is just not as worthy or valuable as farming or something like that, like what a loss it would
Mhm.
be. All of us have the talents of something, God given talents. And so
Yeah, I think that's very important for women, as you said, because we do tend to have that temptation to compare. And I do think it's really important. I mean, it's one of the reasons why, if you look at so many different women thinkers, which I do a lot of, right, from Edith Stein and in the Catholic tradition, but then just going back through a lot of, the early women's rights advocates, but then also you see this in Wollstonecraft, is just this sense of the concern they have if God isn't first, the way in which they kind of like don't know who they are, right? And so the identity, the way in which like our identity is so solid when God is first and we can see the whole. That's what Wollstonecraft talks about, is kind of seeing the whole, because then we know where we fit in the whole. And then we can have more confidence to do what our responsibilities are and not worry, not look around so much at everybody else, which I think is a real temptation for sure.
it absolutely is. Yes. And so your book carries readers through the stages of domestic change, which we've talked about, and even upheaval in our country, particularly offset by the Industrial Revolution, which we mentioned. That moved work increasingly out of the home and undermined the economic interdependence within by putting the homemaking wife at the mercy of the wage earning husband. As legal scholar, professor, and U.S. ambassador to the Holy See, who you mentioned several times already, Mary Ann Glendon, noted, there was an increasing rise in the risk of the four deadly Ds. Number one being disrespect for non market work. Number two, divorce. Number three, disadvantages in the workplace. And number four, destitution. She said modern women have adapted to the situation as best they can by hedging their bets in two ways. They are having fewer children and they're maintaining at least a foothold in the labor force, even when their children are very young. We often encounter this defensive mentality, which has become somewhat standard.
Yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned was the support of your husband and how important that was. And when we look through the early rights activists, we often see, maybe not in their own cases, maybe they personally had a strong, supportive husband, or in other cases, Wollstonecraft, they didn't. And then Susan B. Anthony, no husband at all. So we see all of these different aspects, but there is kind of one voice among all of these women rights activists, which is fighting for the women who don't have that, right? Who maybe don't have the supportive husband, who have been the victims of society, or a drunkard, or, a pregnancy, which then they are abandoned, facing destitution. So walk us through this unraveling and how families safeguard against falling victim to this threatening rhythm. We see most often nowadays divorce, which in previous centuries was probably more destitution than anything.
Yeah, so the story I tell in the book has now been told quite a bit. For most of human history, human beings obviously first hunter-gatherers, but then become agrarian people for a long, long time. And then we have industrialization, and now we're sort of in a post-industrial period and a high-tech period, et cetera. So this period of agrarian homesteads where families and extended families too, not just kind of nuclear families, but extended families where you have people working the farm or having some other type of trade, family shops and that kind of thing. And one of the things I just want to point out, I don't know why it's occurring to me now, but I'm thinking, I guess maybe of Susan B. Anthony, but I'm thinking of that kind of woman in a prior time who really was able to fit into these situations, right? So you have single women who were just be part of a home, it's like they were just one of the people who served in the home and they felt a part of that family. And so you had these big families And, yes, there were different roles that men and women played in those families for sure. I'm reading Little House on the Prairie and all those books with my daughter. So, you see obviously the kind of need for masculine strength in farms is obviously very, very important. Much different from like two lawyers sitting next to each other typing on a computer. Not much need for masculine strength there. So we can understand just right away the change in the kind of work people do. It sort of changes how we think about the differences between men and women, right? The agrarian system starts to decline after our country is founded. And what's interesting about that time is the incentive structure for collaboration is so rich and thick because, in order to survive, you have to collaborate with one another. And so even if your marriage isn't perfect, you're still kind of working together to get the work done, and your children are involved in all of that and everything. And so the system in which wives are legally subordinate to husbands doesn't really cause that much problem for women at that point. It might be an affront to some of them, I suppose. Abigail Adams had a way of talking about this with her own husband, right? And talking about men would be tyrants, all men would be tyrants, that kind of thing. Yes, you can see occasionally a tyrannical man who's, going against his own self-interest and drinking too much and then beating his wife.
Abigail Adams, again, I always saw that as her defending other women,
Yeah,
right? Because
yeah,
certainly
that's
John
right.
Adams
Exactly.
did not seem like a
Right.
tyrant
Not
in
a
any way.
tyrant. That's
The
right.
way he felt she could freely speak to him
Yes.
is testament to the fact that he was not only open, but
Yeah.
appreciative of
Yeah.
that voice and
Yeah.
that tone.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
so, again, another powerful woman who really wasn't necessarily speaking from her own situation, but defending women who
Right.
didn't have the situation as her.
And I think that that's exactly right. I mean, it's really important just to see that the women who end up speaking out, whether it's Wollstonecraft or also the women's rights advocates in our own country, they have the leisure to speak out, right? And so, some of them are, you think about like the Grimke sisters, those are abolitionists who, come up from the South and are horrified by slavery. And so come to the North and want to speak out against slavery and tell all the Northerners, like, let's go, we have to do something about this. And they are told, you're unwomanly, get back in your place. You have no right to do this. You're degrading yourself as a woman by speaking, to both male and female audiences and all that. I mean, but they still had at least the leisure later, I guess. Angelina ends up having children and Sarah helps with those children, but they have that leisure to speak on behalf of others. It's the same with the maternalists like Jane Addams and Florence Kelly, single women who, Jane Addams starting Hull House. I mean, really doing that on behalf of women who have either been abandoned or don't have the husbands that care for them. Obviously, if your husband is doing all the things he should be doing and you don't have any reason to go and fight on behalf of others necessarily or see any problem because you're looking around and everything seems fine. But obviously for these women who had the capacity to go and serve and then see like, oh my gosh, all is not well. Well, why did that happen? I mean, part of it is, as you mentioned, is that as you start to have men pulled out of the family farms, and I mean, think of the kind of alienation that happens there, like generations of, men in that family have had the family farm and then suddenly he no longer can like sustain and care for his own family on his farm and has to be pulled out into the factories and then is beholden to another man, has to be a wage earning person, doesn't have the kind of freedom to own and tend to his own land, and now has to go in this pretty bad working situations. And during that time, there's also like bars and brothels and all those kinds of things. So you mix being away from home, the temptations that men have, and then you have bars and brothels and mix that all together. And you have women being like, what the heck is happening to our men? But there's another element that happens actually during that time, which is the Second Great Awakening. And so you have this infusion of new Christian spirit in these women as well. So they're going to church at way higher numbers than men. The men are having a hard time with alcohol and brothels. Not all men, but some men. And you're seeing, more of an incidence of domestic violence. You're seeing women and children maltreated in the workplace. All of these things mixed together, and you get a movement of women who are motivated by Christian principles, in terms of abolition, but then also temperance and other type of kind of social purity, as Susan B. Anthony would call it. All these kinds of things, looking at ways to improve the lives of especially the poor and working classes, and are doing so. And then these women are writing. So Sarah Grimke's writing, Lucretia Mott is writing, they're coming together, they're having conventions and leaning on each other and trying to figure out a better way forward. And that's what, the early women's movement was about.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned single women because I didn't really think about that or put it together. We, of course, know Susan B. Anthony as this powerful, independent single woman who started the Revolution newspaper. And she was going around speaking, and she's noted for all of these major historical moments, even having herself arrested for trying to vote. So we think back to all of these notable moments in her life as a single woman, but yet, as you said, she always kind of fit in. She had her family, she had her friends, she had her peers that she worked with. And I think there is a sense of isolation in society for single women today. So that's interesting that you noted that. Almost this, where is my place?
It's true, yeah. Being single is sometimes doesn't seem like it has value or something like that. Whereas I think in other times that wasn't the case at all because of the families that stayed in the same place for so long. And so you'd really just fit in as the great aunt and you'd be well respected and all of that. And there's less of a role for that today. I think that's really unfortunate.
Yes, yes. As a Catholic scholar, Mary Wollstonecraft might strike some as an odd choice of a historical feminist to highlight in your work. Yet, despite her unconventional relationships, opposed to marital laws, and the destruction of her reputation by her last husband, you reveal a woman who emphasized virtue and self mastery, envisioning marriage as a relationship of reciprocity and friendship between two equals, a shared project for the upbringing of children, and the best means to restore harmony between the sexes. How was such a woman at odds with legal marriage, and what was Wollstonecraft's original moral vision for women's rights?
When you say she's at odds or she was against legal marriage, so she's against coverture. So that's not against marriage itself, right? And so she's against marriage as it was understood at that point, which is women being legally subordinate to men, but not only that, but also losing all of the rights that they had as what was called a femme sole. So that's that single woman, right? So when you become married, those rights, your personhood basically is incorporated into that of the man, and that's what he has his covering her and that's what the coverture is, and they become one in being in the man, not in the marriage but in the man. And so like property rights, civil rights, etc. And so it's not only that her rights are lost but also her responsibilities are missing too, so she really becomes like less understood in the law. She's not responsible for her own actions.
We obviously don't know this because not every woman wrote or was published. I'm sure there was a lot of women in her time who felt the same way, that they were opposed to this idea of coverture, but it was what there was at the time. It was either
Right.
that or not get married. And so for Wollstonecraft, she does write about her opposition to this. Her first husband that she legally married, the American husband that she had, she
Yeah,
was
yeah.
hesitant to enter into that marriage.
That's a really complicated one because it's not actually a legal marriage, but they're holding themselves out as married because of this. There's others who do it too, like Lucy Stone. So she's one of the great early women's rights advocates in our country. And so she and her husband, because of coverture, because coverture is still existing in their state, they basically make a contract that supersedes coverture. And so that could have been something that she did instead, but they're in the middle of the French Revolution in Paris. And so they decide, well, we'll just have me take your name, but we won't actually get married. And so goes as Mrs. Imlay at that point, and then he abandons her.
I thought they had a kind of a justice of the peace marriage.
No, no. So
Okay.
it's just like, yeah. So it's, yeah. I mean, it's hard, of course, to know precisely what happens, but it is an illegal marriage. No, but she holds herself out as married, and so that's part of the scandal that's caused later because when she dies in childbirth with Mary Shelley, who writes Frankenstein, William Godwin, when he writes her biography, what's crazy about William Godwin's biography, I mean, there's many things that are crazy, but the foremost thing in my mind is that he writes it so quickly after her death, being bereft of losing this woman they've been married for 9 months, basically. And he never talks to her sisters about her life. He's an anarchist and an atheist, and he never trusts her religiosity. So the way he like frames the whole narrative of her life is not fair to her actual life or her actual thought. She had been a very public figure, from all of her different works, but also had written a ton of book reviews and that kind of thing. They're very confused because they thought she was Mrs. Imlay. And then they find out, wait, she wasn't married, causes this scandal, which basically people don't read her work anymore. They just put her to the side. Plus, the fallout from the French Revolution, where she also has a complicated view. It's all this complexity around it. And so people remember her as like, oh, she's this French revolutionary who had this crazy personal life, when none of that is really right. I mean, her personal life is not crazy. It's the fact that she's in the midst of the reign of terror in Paris and she's with a man. And how do they decide what she's going to do in this relationship? Because if she stays as an English woman in Paris, she could be killed. But if she's taken as an American wife, then she won't be killed. There's like all of this negotiation that's happening, but we remember it in this like super simplistic way. So with regard to the French Revolution too, like when she's interacting with Burke and writing against Edmund Burke, people just assume, oh, that means she's totally for the French Revolution and against Burke. And that's not true either. If you go and very carefully read, she says, I am not a utopian. And I think actually, it's not politics that can save us, but eternity. Like she's very clear in A Vindication of the Rights of Man too. So there's a lot of misunderstanding and misconstrol. Why? Because of that first biography of William Godwin. Okay.
My question real quick is why?
Yeah.
Why do you think Godwin did this? I mean, they had albeit a very short marriage, but we assume that it was a marriage in which they loved each other because she acted in.
Yeah, she definitely.
What was his purpose? I mean, she's dead, right? So what is the purpose of destroying her reputation posthumously? Maybe you have more insight of where that came from, first of all. And second of all, I think you did a really good job of vindicating her as a Christian, because for me, I always saw her as a feminist and knew her writing and the work that she did. And I respected that for her time period and what she was doing and how she was advocating for women. However, I always had her as non-Christian in my mind. And I guess it was because of the atheist husband or the associations that I had. Reading her work before, when I was coming from a feminist perspective, I don't know if I just threw out the God quotes or just erased them.
No, there's a reason for this.
Okay.
Basically what happens is Godwin, he is an anarchist activist, right? And like hates marriage, but yet marries her. I can't tell you what his meaning was. I think that he was mourning her and he wanted to write this. I do not find it to be terribly scandalous with everything that goes on right now. It's not like horror and like, oh my gosh, she was this like lewd woman or this free love advocate or something at all. I mean, she writes about chastity throughout her work. She has 2 suicide attempts after Imlay leaves her. And so is really bereft. I mean, dealing with, having had a baby, falling into depression, who knows, we know more about that now when that happens for many women, but she's left. I mean, there's a way in which like Godwin is there and she has this child and there's the provision part, so who knows? I would say that she is taken by certain feminists, especially of the 1970s, and remembered as the way Godwin wanted to portray her. And so when I read excerpts, and I'm sure you only read excerpts when you were in college or whatever, it's like we don't read all of her work. Literally all of the parts about virtue and duty and God are like stripped out of them. So, I mean, I had this situation where I was asked to go and lecture at a major university. So I was going to teach on Burke, Rousseau, and Wollstonecraft. And they sent me the book that they would be using. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's not the full work. And in fact, it looks like she's a secular feminist from what they're presenting to their students, because the editor had stripped all of that out. And the other part too is that when you think of her ahead of time as a French revolutionary, then you can go and read and say, oh, reason means, what the French revolutionaries thought it meant. So remember, she's like a serious intellectual at the time. She's part of a literary community. She's doing tons of book reviews. So she's self-educated. She's involved in philosophical circles. She's engaging with serious minds at the time, but she's also written a bunch of pedagogical books, fiction. And so when you read those and you read her Female Reader, where she brings together scripture and Shakespeare and Milton for the edification of young women, you start to get an entirely different understanding of who this woman is leading up to those major texts of hers. So then when you read the major texts, and you try to figure out, what does this word mean? You don't go straight to the French revolutionaries, you go back to her own work. Okay, so that's all to say, in terms of her being a Christian, I would say we don't know the nature of her Christian belief. She does start to hang out more with the Unitarians. She doesn't have an orthodox view of soteriology or the resurrection and that type of thing, but she's so biblically informed. I mean, think of John Adams. John and Abigail Adams were Unitarians. They understood themselves to be Christians. So even in that way, have a very robust view of the importance of grace and Christ and things like that. It's just not what we might call Trinitarian Orthodox Christianity today, if that makes sense. The final thing I'll say is a Catholic scholar and bringing this vision. So I guess what I would say about that is that as a Catholic who is a legal scholar, my view is not that I look back at history to ensure that it conforms to Catholicism. My view as a Catholic is that I have a responsibility to the truth. So as a scholar, I need to do my work as a professional scholar, a professional legal scholar who's now working a lot in history of ideas. And I need to ensure that I am being as charitable a reader as I can to my subjects. The way I always think of it is like if this person is sitting in the room with me, say like Betty Friedan or Mary Wollstonecraft, and I say, this is what I've read of you. I've read all of your work. I've read tons of secondary literature. This is my sense of who you are. And that they would say, yes, I think you've gotten me pretty much right. I might change this and that. And yeah, I think you've interpreted that wrong. But basically, the thrust of it is the same. And that's what I think I have a really great responsibility to because I'm a Catholic, I'm a Christian who thinks the truth is really important. So if Mary Wollstonecraft does not conform to Catholic orthodoxy, that's true. She doesn't believe in the Eucharist. She calls it hocus pocus. But
Really?
yep, she actually thinks that there's many bad things for women that they get tempted into. Things like it's something like horoscopes, something like that today when people go and have, like their hands read or something. So she's saying women stay away from that. You're Christians. And so she sees Catholicism, which of course she doesn't have access to as a Brit who, they were so anti-Catholic. But anyway, but so she assumes that it's superstition. I don't blame her for that. I also think the atoms are great, and I don't blame them for not having access to what I believe is the fullness of the truth.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I think that was my experience entirely, where everything that I read of Wollstonecraft was stripped of all of those things. When I'm reading your book and reading virtue and
Yeah.
our highest duty is to act in the way that God would want us to act, I was thinking, where did she get this from? This isn't Wollstonecraft. This isn't the Wollstonecraft I know.
Yeah.
And, that was eye-opening for me. So moving forward to 19th century activists, the turn of the century with Margaret Sanger, whose voluntary motherhood and the founding of contraception in the early 20th century decoupled motherhood even further from the home and family. And then, of course, we would be remiss not to mention Betty Friedan and her powerful 1963 manifesto, The Feminine Mystique, which brought on the second wave of feminism. So how did women's rights poignantly change throughout these key moments in history when there was this slow decoupling of motherhood from the home, household duties, and our bodies, which of course is going to lead into Betty Friedan, who at first spoke very favorably about motherhood, her own motherhood and motherhood in general, but then would go on to help found NOW, the National Organization of Women, and to really promote what many people associate with modern feminism, which is abortion rights and women to have complete autonomy of their body.
Yeah, so that's like the story of my whole book. I think the important thing, because it's something we haven't talked about yet, is the perspective I'm giving, or sort of the lens through which I read all of these different thinkers in terms of the legal history, in terms of the philosophical differences, et cetera, is through the lens of sexual asymmetry. And so that is this, basic sense in which both men and women engage in the same sexual act, but it is women and not men who get pregnant. And so in my view, every strand of feminism is trying to think about how injustice to respond to sexual asymmetry. And so in the early movement, you have what I would say are moral and social and political responses. The moral response obviously being male chastity. So male chastity was a very important aspect of the first wave of the women's movement. And voluntary motherhood is a term that actually comes out of Sarah Grimke's work on marriage, where it's voluntarily engaging in that act that would make one a mother. And so that means voluntarily having sex.
Was she putting that into marriage?
Yeah, no. So in terms of marriage, it's engaging in the act within marriage, but it's like the agency for a woman to decline sex within marriage should she not be prepared to become a mother. That's what her understanding of voluntary motherhood is. So what happens with Margaret Sanger is that she flips all of this on its head. And she basically says, oh, this idea of voluntary motherhood is really voluntarily having a child. And so, what her solution to sexual asymmetry then is a technical solution. And so, that's the introduction of birth control. So, instead of it being moral, social, or political, it's technical or technological. And so, that changes everything because then we're relying on techniques and technology and then on pharmaceuticals and that type of thing to do the thing that we really required virtue for, which is what we were talking about at the beginning, right? And that takes time and family and community and all of that versus just popping a pill. We don't even talk about chastity anymore at all. So then, with Betty Friedan, what's interesting with her is that, yes, she is the one who pushes forward abortion. But if you go and read the 1966 original statement for the National Organization for Women, birth control and abortion are not in that statement at all. So I always say that they could conceive of an equal partnership between men and women in the home and in the workplace without abortion and contraception because they did it in the 1966 statement. Betty Friedan kind of capitulated to pragmatism and basically said, like, if we really want women in the workplace at an equal footing with men, then we need abortion. And that opens the door to all of these equality arguments for abortion rights. Think of market equality, even entering the workplace at all, and think that women need abortion and contraception in order to do that. Then you're really kind of putting a band-aid or you're basically never altering the social conditions or economic conditions. You're just leaving them exactly as they are, which is against the possibility of women with their full capacities as potential mothers and then as mothers. And you're never really making public spaces, et cetera, more hospitable for women and their children and their care. And that was very much the way that the first wave thought, is that we need to change institutions to be more hospitable to motherhood and family life. The second wave really slowed that process down because of really relying on abortion in that way.
In a way, I guess that means that we as a society have really capitulated to that same ideal that we don't need to change or improve society outside of the home or the workplace. All we need to do is to change women's function and continue the same disordered agenda that we had before, just allow women to fit into it now that they're, in a sense, neutered to be able to participate in the same way that men are able to.
That's right. Yeah. And just see their fertility as something that's a disease rather than something that's beautiful and healthy and awesome.
Right. All right. Well, Erika, I want to thank you so much for being with us. This has been great. And I want to encourage everyone to read her book, The Rights of Women, as well as the other ones that she's mentioned and her articles. So I want to thank you for joining us here today, Erika.
Thank you so much for having me.